Hello and welcome to this Fox Nation special, Trump on Trial, the Sentencing Live show. I'm Greg Jarrett. Thanks for being here. Well, earlier today, Judge Juan Merchan handed President-elect Donald Trump an unconditional discharge on 34 felony counts in the historic New York so-called hush money case. Joining me now to react is my expert panel. Brian Claypool joins us, criminal defense attorney. And Brian, let me begin with you. And by the way, you're coming to us from a hotel room where you're now living because you're very close to the Eaton fire in Pasadena, California. And I realize you don't even know if your house is still standing. So our thoughts and prayers are with you. I grew up less than a mile from where you are right now. I know it's a difficult time. But the point that Donald Trump was trying to make here is it seems determined that, Alvin Bragg, in concert with Juan Merchan, the judge, are determined to brand him a convicted felon. Is that what's really going on here?
Hey, Greg, thanks for the well wishes, and my thoughts and prayers go out to everybody impacted by the wildfires as well. You are absolutely, categorically, 1,000% correct. Why? Because they pushed so hard for this circus trial. Remember when we were talking about it when the trial was going on and the verdict was coming in? They pushed so hard to get this case to trial. Merchan broke every evidence rule in the books. Remember letting in evidence of alleged sexual escapades, which is clearly irrelevant and character assassination in a criminal trial. They did all of this, right? And then you get to a sentencing and, we're not going to recommend any jail time, and we'll just give you a conditional discharge. That proves exactly what you're saying. This was simply political assassination. It was never meant to try to send Trump to jail, to hold him accountable. It was simply done for the sole purpose of trying to get him convicted, to get him to lose this election. And the proof is in the pudding today. And it's a sad testament, but it's not the end, right? But it's a sad testament to this circus trial that went on.
So the legal theory, Brian, as I understood it to the extent it's understandable, because I actually think it's just incomprehensible, is theoretically a bookkeeping error was concealed to hide an underlying crime. And then the prosecutors rather vaguely said, well, that underlying crime could be one of three things: a campaign finance violation, it could be a tax violation, it could be a further business records violation. And then the judge at the end said, you don't have to, jurors, identify the underlying crime. And in fact, You don't even have to agree unanimously. I would think that every lawyer and even a first-year law student would drop their jaws and say, wait a minute, that's a fundamental violation of a bedrock principle guaranteed by the Constitution, both in New York and federally. How could a judge get away with that?
Yeah, Greg, you were reading my mind because I wanted your viewers to remember what this garbage alleged trial was about. There's two avenues to get this whole circus thrown out of court. This isn't a guilty verdict. This is a political sham. That's what it is. But let's talk about it. The first part you talked about is was there any evidence? There one way to get an appeal, Greg, is an unbiased judge, which we don't have here, can look at the evidence at trial. A defendant's lawyer can file a motion and say, hey, there's no evidence to support the crime that President Trump, allegedly falsified a financial. Greg, you and I talked about this at the verdict. There was not one single piece of evidence at this entire soap opera trial that proved that President Trump had knowledge at all of a falsified financial, number one. And then number two, they had to prove he ratified that. He said, okay, let's go forward with that, right? There was no evidence of that. So if we had a qualified judge, he or she would look at this and say, got to throw this verdict out because there's no evidence to support that Trump knew of financial or falsifying a financial. That's the first way you get this thrown out. The second way is exactly what you're talking about, was even if there was evidence, which there isn't, of Trump falsifying a financial, him even knowing about it, then what was the second crime? You had to prove that it was part of a carrying out a second crime. Do you remember, Greg, when we talked about this? We found out for the first time during closing arguments what this alleged second crime was. That violates the constitutional right of due process. How's the defendant supposed to fight the second crime when he doesn't even know what the second crime is, because the prosecutors don't even know what the second crime is, and they're throwing up a gambit of, like, let's make a deal. Is it door number 1, door number 2, or door number 3? And then you're right. Then to say, oh, you don't need to have an anonymous verdict. And then on top of that, we have an immunity decision. This judge should have gone back to that jury and said, hey, what is the second crime? What is it? What did you all agree on? Did you agree on this unanimously? Because if it's the election, that's a federal issue, and that clearly is subject to immunity, which would be grounds to tossing out this entire sham verdict.
Yeah, Brian, I think Ron is right. That Merchan calculated that if he announced ahead of time no punishment, the Supreme Court would be less likely to take the case. Nevertheless, 4 justices said they should have taken the case. Why? And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's because they were trying to adhere to their July 1st ruling on immunity, which says that if a trial court judge denies an immunity protection for a defendant in circumstances such as this, he has a right to an immediate interlocutory appeal, and all further proceedings are immediately halted. The Supreme Court didn't halt it, as they said they would, did they?
Yeah, Greg, before I comment on that, let's talk a little bit about the millions of dollars spent on this trial. I certainly hope there's not a natural disaster in New York or Manhattan like we're facing out here in LA County, because everybody in that city and across this country is going to be asking, hey, where could that few $million, several $1 million have gone to help deal with a natural disaster in New York City? And to Ron's point about school systems and everything, it's just a flat out irresponsible maneuver by prosecutors. But let's talk about what you just said. It's absolutely categorically clear why Merchan flagged what he was going to do. And I think all of you would agree, right, that never happens, right? Hey, we got a sentencing hearing coming up. By the way, here's what I'm going to do, everybody. That doesn't happen in the real world. But Merchan did that because you're exactly right, Greg. He wanted to flag to the U.S. Supreme Court that I'm not going to send President Trump to jail. So they would back off, right? They're going to back off now. Let this show go forward this morning. Why? Because let's call it what it is. Merchan wanted the last word. And you heard it at the end there in your audio. He wanted to have the last word here. He wanted to peg it one more time to President Trump. And that is the travesty in all of this, Greg. This never was a proper use of our judicial system. This was using our judicial system to promote a radical political agenda. That is flat out what this was for. And in U.S. history, I hope this will be a deterrent now in the next 100 years to prevent this from ever happening again.
Even though, Brian, 2 people testified that Trump had nothing whatsoever to do with the accounting method of calling the reimbursement a legal expense, Michael Cohen was the only person who sort of said, well, I can't say for sure, but I was under the impression that Trump was behind it. And yet, Michael Cohen was a confessed serial liar. He was forced to admit it over and over again in front of this New York jury that he went to prison for lying to Congress and to others, to banks, you name it. He lied to everybody. And then in a surprising moment in the courtroom, he was forced to admit that part of what was going on was that he stole $60,000 from Donald Trump during this whole Stormy Daniels payment. I would think that jurors would immediately disregard everything he had to say. Wouldn't you?
Yeah, Greg. But your comment presupposes that the jurors are in a courtroom where we've got a fair and unbiased judge who's equally applying the law, right? That's the presupposition in your comment. The fact of the matter is here that these jurors, you and I were talking about that when it was going down. We were flabbergasted about Cohen. He was decimated on cross-exam. We were all like, how could a jury ever rely on a single word that's coming out of Cohen's mouth? But why did the jury put credence in what Cohen said? Because there's a third grounds for appeal that I forgot to mention before, right? Here's the third grounds for appeal, and this is why the jury listened to Cohen. It's because this judge allowed testimony in this case that suggested that President Trump was putting. Remember Stormy Daniels? Oh, I felt afraid. Remember that? Like, oh, I felt like I couldn't get out of the room, and suggesting that President Trump may have engaged in a sexual assault. Do you remember that? Like that?
Yeah.
Allowing that testimony, allowing testimony about Melania Trump, and you know, sexual prowess. I am telling you, I've done so many jury trials. That is flat out, categorically inadmissible in a criminal trial that's involving an allegation of falsifying an accounting record. It has absolutely nothing to do with the alleged crime, number one. And then number two, there is an evidence rule in every courtroom. Greg, you've tried cases. There is an evidence rule that says even if a piece of evidence is somehow relevant, it's not here, that the prejudice, if it overrides the relevance, it needs to be tossed out of court. In any courtroom across this country, other than Merchan's, none of that evidence of the sexual misconduct, her feeling threatened by Trump, would have ever come into court. And then this jury could have seen through a more clear lens what was going on with Cohen. And then you have a not guilty verdict. That's the tragedy in this case. But the good news is that's a third way for Trump's lawyers to get this total garbage thrown out of court.
And thanks to you, our viewers at home, for watching Trump on Trial, the Sentencing Live show.